Do you know how to war and wage war over your prophetic word? So I want to give you 5 ways that you can wage war over your prophetic word. Now, what I mean by that is this. Someone has given you a prophetic word, and you receive that prophetic word, and you've read, and you prayed, and you've tested it, and you believe that this prophetic word is from God. What do you do then? Well, sometimes, and a lot of time, you need to actually stand up and start warring over your prophetic word. Start standing and waging war over the word that God has given you. Now, a lot of the time you think just because you've been given a prophetic word, that is going to happen. It's going to automatically transpire. That prophetic word is going to automatically happen. And sometimes it doesn't happen. No, a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, but sometimes prophetic words fall to the ground. Those prophetic words don't come to pass. And there's lots of reasons as to why prophetic words don't come to pass. I think we made a video on it, which I'll put up there somewhere. We can click and watch. So there are a number of ways that prophetic words, a number of reasons why prophetic words don't necessarily come to pass. But during that time of the prophetic word being fulfilled, we need to actually stand our ground and start roaring and war over that prophetic word. So, the first tip is don't let your prophetic word grow cold. Don't let that prophetic word grow cold. If you really believe that the Lord has spoken to you, if you really believe that this prophetic word is from God, don't let it go cold. Don't put that prophetic word on the shelf somewhere and just don't do anything with it. You just let that word gather dust on the shelf. That's not why God gave you that word. God doesn't give you a word for you to be inactive about it. God gave you a prophetic word to be active and proactive about it. So you don't let words grow cold. You start praying over those words. You start watching over those words. Start watching over those words. Don't let it go cold. Don't let the gifting that God's given you grow cold. Don't let the calling that God's given you grow cold. Whatever God's given you, don't let it grow cold. And prophetic words is one of that. Don't let it go cold. Keep it constantly, consistently before the Lord. And maybe you may have to do that for weeks. You may have to do that for months. You may have to do that for years, maybe even decades. Sometimes some prophetic words will take decades to be fulfilled. So during that period of waiting, during that period, don't let it go cold. So the second tip, or the second step, I would say, is continually pray. Prayer and intercession. Continually pray and intercede over that word. So God's given you a word. Let's make something up. So God's given you a word about being a worship leader. For example, that's the easy one to pick on. So God's given you a prophetic word about leading worship and being a worship leader. So we start praying about that. We start interceding over that prophetic word. We start praying over it. We start waging war in the heavenlies over that prophetic word. We start laying it down before God and start interceding. Maybe gather intercessors around you and prayer warriors around you. Start praying to rent the heavens and start declaring this prophetic word over your life. To start speaking it over your life. Start praying it. Start interceding. Start storming the gates of heaven over that prophetic word. Pray and intercede over that word. Maybe even do some fasting. Maybe even fast over that prophetic word. But you see, what you're doing is you've been diligent to what God has given you. It's like the parable with the sowers and the parable of the manager that went away and left his servants with money. And what do you do with what God gives you? Do you go and bury it? Do you go and hide it? Or do you invest it back into what God has said? So we need to invest things back into the kingdom. Invest back into what God has said. So sometimes, fasting, praying and interceding and declaring that prophetic word over your life. Stand up, declaring that prophetic word over situations. If it looks, for a worship leader example, if it looks like you're never going to be a worship leader and all the doors are closed and there's no opportunities, you start declaring, start speaking to those walls what God has said. Interceding, walls come down, situations, align yourself with what the Lord has said. So it brings us on to number 3, which sometimes remind God what he said. You know, we can declare, we can intercede, we can pray, but also it's saying, God, remember this. Lord, remember that. In the Old Testament, they used to make records of what God had said to remind the people, and also just to remind God, this is what you have said. I'm reminding you, Lord, of what you said. You said, Lord, that I'm going to be a worship leader. You said, Lord, about being worship. I'm reminding you. I'm bringing this before you, God. Once again, I'm bringing this prophetic word before you, and I'm reminding you about what you said. And even if the circumstances look complete opposite, I'm reminding you. Say, God, look, I'm reminding you. I'm bringing this before you. I'm constantly bringing this back to you, Lord. Bringing it back to you. Now, God doesn't forget. Obviously, God doesn't forget. But sometimes we just need to... There's a spiritual principle in saying, God, this is what you said. You're standing on the promises of God. You're standing on his promises. And God's promises, he's a promise keeper. God keeps his promises. So you're standing on that promise and reminding God of what he has said and what he has spoken. Positioning yourself in alignment in accordance with that prophetic word. Which means, about worship leader example, it means you start learning about worship music. You start knowing and researching and studying and meditating on worship. What does it mean to be a worshipper? Start reading books about worship. Start reading books about being a worship leader. Maybe go on courses about worship leading. Enhance your musical abilities. Start learning how to play the keyboard or the guitar or whatever. Take singing lessons. You start positioning yourself practically. Start positioning yourself in alignment with that prophetic word. Positioning yourself in accordance to what God has said. Positioning yourself, being due diligence over that prophetic word, to making sure that you are acting in accordance practically with what God has said. Because in a worship leader example, 9 times out of 10, unless the Lord does something miraculous, you're not automatically going to have a fantastic singing voice. You're not automatically going to be a musical genius. It takes practice, it takes time, it takes dedication. And so you need to start learning how to maybe play the keyboard, learning how to sing. Sometimes it doesn't supernaturally appear on you. You have to go away and hone your natural earthly abilities. So that's what I mean by positioning yourself. You take practical steps. Alignment, aligning yourself with what God has said. Even if the circumstances, the natural, don't look like it, by aligning yourself, you are aligning your life with what God has said in heaven. You're aligning yourself with heaven. Lastly, you need to watch out for the thief. See, Satan is a thief. Satan comes to steal and to rob and to maim and destroy. Satan doesn't want that prophetic word to come about. Satan doesn't want you to fulfill your destiny in God. So he wants to come as a thief and to rob and to steal. So you need to be aware and on guard for the thief. You need to watch out for his little foxes. You need to be like a watchman on the wall over that prophetic word. So the thief doesn't come in and start stealing that prophetic word. Maybe even come in to whisper things like, did God really say? Like Adam and Eve, did God really say you're going to be a worship leader? Did God really say that you're going to lead the congregations in worship? Did God really say you're going to write songs? Did God really say you're going to make a worship album? Did God really say you're going to be using worship to usher people into his presence? Did God really say that about you? You start putting that doubt, and you start to then stop aligning yourself with God, and you start aligning yourself with Satan. You start agreeing with what Satan is saying over your life and not what God is saying over your life. And you can sabotage things that way. So the enemy's going to come in like a thief. The enemy's going to start putting traps in to take your mind off course. So you're not focusing on what God has said. You're not focusing on that worship leader, for example. And so you start to go off into other areas. You start to go off into tangents. Satan's going to come as a thief. So you need to watch out for the thief. Don't give the thief ground. Don't let him have access into your life. Don't let him have access onto your ground. I think one of the mistakes that Adam and Eve made in the garden was they allowed Satan into the garden to question God. So Adam and Eve had authority in the garden, yet they allowed the snake to question God And that's, I think, the first mistake that they made, because at that point they should have stomped out. They should have said no, but they allowed the snake to speak. So don't allow the snake to speak. Don't allow the thief to rob. So watch over your prophetic word. So this is why we need to war and wage war over our prophetic words. And you may need to do this for years or for decades. Stand on what God has said. Stand in faith over what the Lord has said. So there are 5 ways that I think you can wage war over your prophetic word and war yourself into victory. If you found this helpful, please subscribe and like this, and I'll talk to you again soon.